Ziggy, a street dog with a wild past, had never known trust. Sophie, a homegrown pet, had always felt safe in her owner's arms. But when the unspoken language of dogs begins to stir between them, they realize the bond they share holds more than just friendship. It holds a dangerous truth. What they uncover about a mysterious airline employee will change everything. Ziggy's arrival. Ziggy had never felt at home in a cage, yet here he was, trapped in the stark white walls of the Hawaiian quarantine facility. The scent of disinfectant clung to the air, mixing with the faint smell of salt water from the distant ocean. It was as if the island's beauty was in direct contrast to the sterile prison-like environment he found himself in. For a dog like him, the streets had been both sanctuary and battleground. He was used to the freedom of the mainland, where survival meant being quick, clever, and always on the move. But now everything was different, and all he could do was wait. He'd been through a lot to get here, a long journey from the mainland, but that was nothing compared to the cage he found himself in. Ziggy had spent his life on the streets, but the idea of being held captive behind bars like this made him feel something he'd never experienced. Helpless. As he lay on the cold concrete floor, he could hear the distant hum of voices from the staff behind closed doors. Every so often, they would come in to check on the dogs, feeding them scraps or administering vaccines. They treated the animals like commodities, objects to be shuffled around, processed, and shipped off. He had no idea why he was here or what would happen next, but one thing was clear: Hawaii was not like anywhere else. The isolation began to wear on him after a few days. He could feel the walls closing in. Every time he heard the staff's footsteps approaching, his heart would race. He wanted out. He wasn't used to waiting. He wasn't used to being treated like something that could be controlled. And yet, something about the place bothered him beyond the confinement. There was a quiet sense of unease, something in the air that told him there was more to the island than the paradise it seemed to be on the surface. He couldn't explain it, but Ziggy had been around long enough to know that when things seemed too perfect, there was always something dark lurking just beneath the surface. He scratched at the bars of his cage and let out a low growl, his instincts telling him there was something wrong, something he couldn't yet put his paw on. And all he could do was wait. He hated waiting. Sophie's curiosity. Sophie had always known her place in the world. She was a well-cared-for dog, cherished by her owners, the family who had taken her in as a puppy. The life she led was one of luxury, full of soft beds, plenty of food, and endless affection. Her family, Carol and her 2 young children, treated her as more than a pet. She was part of the family. She had never known hardship like Ziggy did. Sophie had grown up in Hawaii, on the edge of the quiet coastal town of Kailua, where the sparkling blue ocean met the warm sand. It was an idyllic life, but as she had gotten older, she began to notice things, small, subtle details that didn't sit right with her. Whispers among the humans, hushed conversations at the local parks, and the way people seemed to avoid certain topics when pets were involved. She had heard rumors about the quarantine process for animals arriving from the mainland, how pets were held in isolation for long periods, often with little explanation. Sophie had always assumed it was simply to ensure that pets from the mainland didn't bring diseases into the island's delicate ecosystem. But there was something in the way the quarantine laws were enforced that didn't feel quite right, something that felt controlled, unnatural. One day, after her usual morning walk along the beach with Carol, Sophie decided to investigate further. Carol, as usual, was distracted by her phone, talking to colleagues about her job at the airline. Sophie's curiosity got the better of her, and as she trotted ahead, sniffing the air, she noticed something unusual: a man and a woman whispering near the base of the old airport terminal. They seemed to be talking in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders as if they were making sure no one was listening. Sophie, ever the curious dog, moved closer, her ears perked. She recognized the woman, Susan, the same Susan who worked at the airport, the one everyone whispered about, but no one dared to approach. She had always seemed off to Sophie, cold and distant. She was one of the few humans who seemed to regard Sophie with indifference, unlike Carol, who showered her with affection. "Don't understand why it's taking so long to get the mainland dogs processed," the man was saying in a low voice, his tone filled with frustration. "The quarantine laws, they've been pushing them further and further back. It's almost like they're trying to delay things for some reason." Susan's voice was cold and controlled. "We've got our orders," she said. "Don't question it." Sophie's heart began to race. There it was again, another reference to the quarantine system that didn't make sense. She had heard about dogs being delayed for longer than necessary, dogs that seemed to vanish from the system altogether, and pets that were lost or reassigned to unknown destinations. She had heard too many whispers for it all to be a coincidence. As they walked away, Sophie stood there staring after them, her mind spinning with confusion. What was really going on behind the scenes? She had to know more. Something in Susan's cold, authoritative voice had unsettled her deeply. A growing friendship. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She started paying closer attention to the dogs that had come through the quarantine process. Some of them behaved strangely, avoiding people and other animals, barking at nothing in particular. Others seemed oddly agitated or frightened, as if something invisible was haunting them. One morning, Sophie decided to venture further into the town, to the area near the airport where Ziggy had been kept in quarantine. There was something about his eyes, his guarded demeanor, that made her think he might know more about the island's mysteries than anyone else. He had been through the system after all. If anyone knew what was really going on, it was him. Sophie found Ziggy in a small park, sitting alone by a fountain, his head slightly tilted as he watched a group of children playing nearby. He looked out of place in this peaceful setting, his wild appearance stark against the manicured grass and well-kept benches. She approached him cautiously, unsure of how he might react. Ziggy had always kept his distance from other dogs, especially the pampered ones like Sophie. But there was something about him that intrigued her, something raw and honest. "Hi, Ziggy," Sophie called softly, her voice warm but hesitant. Ziggy turned his head slowly, his eyes scanning her face. He studied her for a long moment, and Sophie wondered if he was sizing her up. She could see the guarded look in his eyes, the wariness he carried with him. But then, after a beat of silence, he gave a small nod, acknowledging her presence. "Hey, Sophie," he said gruffly, his voice low and scratchy, the result of a life lived on the streets. "You're looking well." Sophie smiled, her tail wagging slightly. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the quarantine system. It's strange, isn't it?" Ziggy looked away, his gaze shifting to the horizon. "Strange? That's an understatement." "What do you mean?" Sophie asked, tilting her head slightly. Ziggy stood up, his movements stiff, as if he was considering whether or not to share more. "I've been through that quarantine system, Sophie. It's not what it seems. There's something going on behind the scenes, something darker." Sophie's ears perked. "What do you know?" Ziggy let out a heavy sigh, his eyes narrowing as he glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "I don't know all the details, but I've heard things. Dogs that come in from the mainland don't always leave. Some of them disappear without a trace, and those that stay, they're not the same." Sophie's heart raced. "Disappearing dogs?" Ziggy nodded gravely. "Yeah, and I think it has something to do with Susan." Sophie's eyes widened. "Susan? What's she got to do with it?" Ziggy paused, looking directly at Sophie. I'm not sure, but I know she's involved somehow. She's the one who controls everything. The quarantine, the dogs that come and go. And I think she's hiding something. The Secrets of Susan. Over the next few days, Sophie and Ziggy began to investigate Susan's activities more closely. Sophie spent time at the airport, observing her whenever she could. She noticed Susan's coldness toward the animals. Sophie also saw the way Susan interacted with certain staff members, a kind of silent communication that seemed strange to Sophie. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was definitely something off about Susan. Meanwhile, Ziggy's instincts led him to a disturbing discovery. Late one night, he found a small hidden room behind the quarantine area, guarded by a single locked door. There, in the dim light of a storage closet, he found crates filled with paperwork, some of it marked with codes that seemed too formal and technical for ordinary quarantine logs. Ziggy realized that these papers weren't about health checks or vaccination records. They seemed to be about ownership. Ownership of dogs, tracking them, moving them from place to place. The documents didn't make sense, but it wasn't until he heard a low, raspy voice that he realized someone was watching him. "Get away from there," Susan hissed, stepping into the room, her shadow falling across Ziggy's face.
Ziggy stood his ground, meeting her gaze. "What's going on here, Susan?" Susan's face twisted into an unpleasant smile. "You shouldn't be here, dog. You don't know what you're meddling with." Ziggy's heart raced, and he began to understand the full scope of Susan's role in the mystery of the island. She wasn't just managing the quarantine system, she was using it to cover something much darker. Strange behavior. Sophie and Ziggy's investigation into Susan's involvement in the quarantine system began to take a toll on both of them. Sophie's once peaceful life, filled with walks along the beach and playful afternoons, now felt like a distant memory. Every day, the mystery grew deeper, and the island, once a paradise, became more and more unsettling. Ziggy had always been on edge, but now Sophie, too, felt a gnawing unease that she couldn't shake. The other dogs on the island, those who had come through the quarantine process, were acting strangely. She noticed it at the dog park, during walks on the beach, even in the neighborhood. Dogs that used to greet her with enthusiasm and friendly barks now avoided eye contact, their tails tucked, their ears flattened. Some barked at nothing, while others refused to leave their homes, staring out the windows with wide, unblinking eyes. The more Sophie observed, the more convinced she became that something sinister was at play. She turned to Ziggy for answers, but even his usual cynicism was shaken. "What's happening to them, Ziggy?" Sophie asked, her voice filled with concern. "Why are all the dogs acting like this? What is Susan doing to them?" Ziggy's sharp eyes darted toward the nearby park, where a group of dogs were gathered, their postures stiff and their eyes wary. "I don't know, Sophie," he said, his voice gruff. "But I've been through enough of that quarantine system to know that it changes you. There's something about it, something they're not telling us." Sophie felt a chill run down her spine. She had been so focused on uncovering Susan's secrets that she hadn't thought about the toll the quarantine process might have on the dogs themselves. There was a pattern here, one she hadn't seen before. The dogs weren't just being quarantined, they were being controlled. As Sophie's thoughts raced, she watched a dog across the park who had always been friendly to her, a fluffy golden retriever named Max. Today, however, Max barely acknowledged her presence. He stood in the corner, his eyes distant and his body tense. Sophie took a few tentative steps toward him, calling his name softly. "Max? Are you okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. Max slowly turned his head, his eyes vacant, as if he were seeing through her rather than looking at her. Then, without a word, he turned and trotted off toward the edge of the park, his tail dragging. Sophie's heart sank. This wasn't just an odd behavior, this was something far more disturbing. The dogs were losing themselves. Whatever was happening in the quarantine process was warping their minds, their instincts, their very personalities. It wasn't just a disease or sickness, it was something far darker. Ziggy watched the scene unfold with a furrowed brow. "This isn't normal, Sophie," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Whatever's going on here, it's much worse than I thought." Sophie nodded, her thoughts racing. There was only one person who could explain this, Susan. And she needed to confront her, whether she was ready or not. The truth behind the quarantine. Sophie and Ziggy's investigation led them to the heart of the mystery, Susan's hidden activities at the airport and quarantine facility. Sophie could feel the weight of the truth slowly creeping closer. She had never been one for confrontation, but something inside her urged her to press forward. The dogs on the island were counting on her, and Ziggy's trust in her had become a source of strength. One afternoon, they decided to follow Susan as she left work, keeping their distance but staying close enough to track her movements. They watched as she walked briskly down a quiet street, her expression hard and unrelenting. It didn't take long for Sophie to realize that Susan was heading toward an area of the island she had never seen before, a part of the island that was off-limits to the public. The two dogs followed her through winding streets until they came to a small, nondescript building near the harbor. It looked like a storage facility, its windows covered with heavy blinds and the door locked tight. Susan entered the building without looking back, disappearing behind the heavy door. "What is this place?" Sophie whispered, her ears flattened in suspicion. Ziggy, ever cautious, sniffed the air and looked around. "I don't know, but I've got a feeling it's not good," he said, his eyes narrowing. "We need to find out what's inside." They waited until nightfall, watching the building from the shadows. Sophie's paws itched to move, to discover what lay behind that locked door, but she knew they had to be careful. The last thing they needed was to alert Susan to their presence. As the hours passed, the building grew silent, and the street lights flickered in the cool night air. It was now or never. Ziggy led the way, moving silently toward the side of the building where a small service entrance stood. He pushed gently at the door, his instincts telling him it would be unlocked. To his surprise, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow hallway. They slipped inside, the door closing softly behind them. The air was stale, and the space smelled faintly of metal and old wood. Sophie's heart raced as she moved cautiously down the hallway, her senses heightened. Ziggy's presence beside her gave her the courage to continue. The hallway opened into a large room, filled with crates and cages. At first, it seemed like just another storage area, but as Sophie's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she realized the crates were filled with animals. Dogs. Cats. Small animals of all kinds. And they were all eerily quiet. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen anything like this before. The animals were huddled in their cages, staring blankly at the walls, their eyes dull and lifeless. Ziggy growled softly, his body tense. This is wrong." Sophie nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "What are they doing here? Why are they all locked away?" It was then that Sophie noticed something else. On a small table in the corner of the room was a stack of papers. She padded over to it, her tail low, and scanned the papers. They were filled with names, dates, and what looked like tracking numbers. Sophie's eyes widened as she recognized the names of some of the dogs from the quarantine process. They were marked with a note in bold red letters, "No adoption." This is a list of the dogs that were supposed to go home with families," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling with shock. "But they're not. They're being kept here. Like prisoners." Ziggy's eyes darkened with anger. "Susan's not just controlling the quarantine. She's keeping these dogs for herself. This is a smuggling ring, a cover-up." Sophie's blood ran cold. The dogs weren't just being isolated, they were being hidden, locked away and controlled by Susan and her operation. And she had been blind to it, living in the island's false peace, until now. The weight of the truth settled over them, heavy and suffocating. Sophie knew they couldn't let this continue. They had to expose Susan, but how? She glanced at Ziggy, whose eyes mirrored her own determination. Together, they would find a way to bring the truth to light. The confrontation. The hidden room was silent, the weight of their discovery hanging heavy in the air. Sophie's mind raced, trying to piece together the horrible truth. Ziggy stood still, his sharp eyes scanning the crates filled with lifeless animals, the horror in the room creeping into his veins like a poison. These were not just abandoned pets, they were part of an underground operation, and Susan was at its center. "We can't leave here without telling someone," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. "But what if Susan finds out we were here?" Ziggy's lips curled back in a silent snarl. "We can't let her keep getting away with this. She's been running this operation for far too long, Sophie." Sophie glanced back at the crates, her heart heavy with guilt. "But how do we stop her? She's got control over the quarantine system, over everything." "We find a way to prove it," Ziggy said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "We get the evidence. Expose her. The truth is our only weapon now." Sophie nodded, determination flooding her chest. There was no turning back now. They had uncovered a web of lies and deceit, and they couldn't walk away without putting an end to it. They silently retreated from the storage room, carefully closing the door behind them. The air felt thicker as they stepped back into the hallway, the hum of the fluorescent lights above almost deafening. Sophie's nerves were on edge, her every step cautious. If Susan or anyone else caught them snooping around, they would be in serious trouble. But they had no choice now, there was too much at stake. "Let's head back to your place," Ziggy said, leading the way. "We need to figure out our next move. But we can't act too quickly. Susan's already suspicious. We need to be smart." Sophie agreed, her mind still reeling from what they had seen. She had no idea how deep the corruption ran, but one thing was clear: Susan wasn't just a worker at the airport. She was the mastermind of an operation that had been exploiting and smuggling animals for years. The island, which Sophie had once believed to be a peaceful paradise, was built on lies. And it was up to her and Ziggy to expose the truth. The final twist. The following days were a blur. Ziggy and Sophie spent their time gathering as much evidence as they could, notes, documents, and even recordings of the strange behavior in the quarantine facility. Sophie took advantage of her position as a well-loved dog in the community, making friends with other pets who had been through the quarantine process. The more she learned, the clearer it became: the dogs were being systematically conditioned, their behavior altered as part of Susan's larger plan. But it was one of the documents they discovered that changed everything: a list of names. It wasn't just the dogs that had been quarantined. It was the pets who had been marked for special treatment, and were scheduled to be sent to unknown locations. It turned out that Susan had been using the island's strict quarantine system to funnel dogs into the black market, sending them to owners in mainland cities who had paid handsomely for rare, exotic breeds. Sophie's blood ran cold as she stared at the names on the list: dogs from local families, pets that had been lost or vanished. They were being smuggled, sold off to the highest bidder. Sophie realized just how much of an underground industry Susan was running, and the damage it had done to the island's beloved pets. But what shocked Sophie the most was a name at the bottom of the list: Carol. Her owner. Her beloved Carol. Sophie's heart stopped. Carol had been on that list, her name marked as someone who had unknowingly been part of the scam. Sophie couldn't understand it. Why would Carol's name be here? Had Carol been somehow involved in Susan's operation? Or was she a victim, just like the dogs? Panic rose in Sophie's chest. If Carol was involved, everything Sophie had known about her life would be a lie. Ziggy, noticing her distress, looked at the list and then back at Sophie. "What's wrong?" Sophie's voice shook as she pointed to Carol's name. "Carol, she's on this list. My owner, she's listed as someone whose dog is being sold off. But Carol, she didn't know about this. She couldn't have known. She loved me. Ziggy narrowed his eyes, his mind racing. If she's being used, that means Susan's reach is even deeper than we thought. We need to find out what's really going on. We can't let her get away with this. Sophie nodded, determination flooding her once more. They had to find Carol. They had to find out how deep Susan's control ran and stop it before it was too late. The confrontation. Later that night, Sophie and Ziggy made their way back to the quarantine facility, their hearts heavy with the weight of their discovery. They knew they had to confront Susan now. There was no more time for hesitation. They couldn't let the island's corrupt system continue, not with Carol's name on the list. As they arrived at the back of the facility, they saw Susan standing outside the door, her cold eyes scanning the area. She was alone, but Sophie could sense that she knew something was off. There was no turning back now. Sophie stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Susan," she called out, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "It's over." Susan turned slowly, her face contorting into a wicked grin. "You think you've won, don't you, Sophie?" she sneered. "You don't even know the full truth. You think you've uncovered something, but you're just scratching the surface." Sophie's voice was filled with defiance. "We know everything, your operation, the illegal dog trade. You've been hiding behind the quarantine laws for years, using them as a cover for your own selfish desires. But it's over now." Susan's eyes narrowed as she stepped closer. "You're naive if you think this will change anything. The quarantine system is far more than just a law. It's a safeguard, a necessary part of life on this island. Without it, the chaos would spread. I've simply kept the balance." Sophie could feel her pulse quicken, the weight of Susan's words pressing on her. "You've been manipulating everything, including my life. My owner, Carol, she's part of your network. She didn't even know it. You've been pulling the strings, controlling everything from behind the scenes." Susan laughed bitterly, her voice echoing through the quiet night. "Your owner? She was always just a pawn, Sophie. Like everyone else. You were never meant to stay in that house. You're just part of the game." Sophie's eyes burned with fury. "I'm not your pawn, Susan. I'm going to expose you. I'll make sure everyone knows what you've done." The unraveling truth. The night air was heavy with tension as Sophie and Ziggy stood face to face with Susan, the mastermind behind the island's corrupt pet trade. The confrontation had been long in the making, but the weight of their discoveries had led them to this moment. The anger that had simmered within Sophie, the anxiety and dread of uncovering the dark underbelly of her home, now coiled inside her like a tight knot. Her heart raced as she stared at Susan, who stood calmly before them, a twisted smile curving her lips. Sophie's voice was cold, biting. "You've manipulated everything, haven't you? The quarantine laws, the dogs, the families, Carol. You've been using them all. You used me." Susan's eyes flashed with something dark, contempt, perhaps, but there was also something more, something that Sophie couldn't place. It was as if Susan had seen through her, as though she had expected this confrontation all along. "You think you've figured it out, Sophie?" Susan's voice was like ice, calm yet dripping with malice. "You're so naive. You have no idea what's really going on here. The quarantine laws," she paused, as though savoring the moment, "they're not just a means to protect the island. They're a necessary tool, a safeguard for what's to come." Sophie stepped forward, her pulse hammering in her ears. "What are you talking about? What's to come?" Susan's laugh was quiet, like a snake's hiss. "You don't think this island can stay isolated forever, do you? You think the mainland will just let us live in peace, free from their control? The quarantine laws are part of a larger plan, one that extends beyond the reach of the simple-minded humans here. The truth is, the quarantine isn't just about pets or diseases, it's about control. And the dogs are the key." Ziggy, who had been silent, watching, now stepped forward, his voice low and full of contempt. So, you've been using us, using the dogs, as part of some sick game, Susan? Susan's eyes glittered with cold satisfaction. Not just using them. I've been protecting the island from the chaos that exists out there. The mainland is a mess, corruption, greed, violence. You think Hawaii is untouched by that? The quarantine system is a shield. And she looked at Sophie, I am its keeper. You may have thought you were just a pampered pet, Sophie. But you were always meant for something bigger. You were never supposed to stay in that house. I made sure of that. Sophie's stomach twisted. The words cut deep. She had never considered that she had been part of something larger than just the life she knew. To think that Susan had been orchestrating this whole thing, controlling the dogs, her own life included, was a betrayal she couldn't fully grasp. No, Sophie whispered, her voice shaking with anger. You're wrong. I was never a part of your plan. You don't control me. I control my own fate. Ziggy growled softly beside her, his body tensed, ready for whatever came next. And the dogs? What about them? You're the one who's been keeping them locked away in that facility, turning them into your pawns. How many more have you hurt? Susan's smile remained fixed, as though she was playing a game with them. You think I've hurt anyone? I've kept them safe. Kept them from the real dangers. But you wouldn't understand. You've only known one side of this island, one side of life. The rules are in place for a reason. They've kept everything in order. Without them, you would never have been safe. Sophie's heart pounded. She realized now that Susan didn't care about her. Or the dogs. It wasn't about safety or peace, it was about power. Susan had used the system to manipulate everyone, from the locals to the mainlanders. And Sophie had been a part of it, unknowingly. No more, Sophie said, her voice firmer than it had been before. No more lies. No more secrets. You've hurt too many for too long, Susan. This ends now. Ziggy nodded, his eyes fixed on Susan with steely determination. We're going to expose you. We'll make sure everyone knows what you've been hiding. Susan's smile faded, replaced by a deep, cold fury. You think exposing me will stop it? You can't fight the system, Sophie. You can't fight what's been built. It's already too late. But Sophie, despite her fear, stood tall. Then I'll make sure everyone knows it's never too late to change. The final reveal. The days after their confrontation were a blur of planning, secrecy, and quiet action. Sophie and Ziggy worked tirelessly to gather the evidence they needed to expose Susan's underground network. They snuck into the quarantine facility once again, this time with more determination than ever. They took photos of the paperwork, copied the lists of names, and recorded the conversations between the workers who had unknowingly become pawns in Susan's game. Sophie felt a weight lift from her shoulders with every piece of evidence they gathered. But she knew that exposing Susan wouldn't be enough. They had to take down the entire system, the quarantine laws, the underground network, the corruption that had existed for so long. One evening, after a long day of sneaking around, Sophie and Ziggy made their way to the local newspaper office. They had spent days compiling everything, the evidence, the recordings, the testimonies from former employees who had worked under Susan's influence. Now it was time to tell the world. Inside the office, the editor, a grizzled man with tired eyes, listened carefully as Sophie and Ziggy explained everything. He was skeptical at first. He had heard rumors about the quarantine system and Susan, but nothing concrete. But when Sophie laid out the evidence, his eyes widened. This is huge, he said, his voice low with disbelief. If this is true, Susan could bring down the entire island. We're not just exposing Susan, Sophie said, her voice steady. We're exposing the entire system. The quarantine laws are a cover for something darker. We need to stop it. We need to stop the manipulation. The editor nodded grimly. I'll get this published. It's going to shake this island to its core. Breaking the chains. The following weeks were a whirlwind. The story broke, and the island was shaken. The news of Susan's involvement in the illegal pet trade, the manipulation of the quarantine system, and the dark secrets behind the operation sent ripples through the community. People were horrified by the truth, and many were angry. The corruption had been hidden for so long, and now it was out in the open. Susan was arrested, along with several accomplices who had been involved in the scheme. The quarantine facility was shut down, and new laws were quickly put in place to prevent future exploitation of animals. The government was forced to re-evaluate the quarantine system and ensure that it served its intended purpose, protecting the island, not hiding the truth. Sophie and Ziggy's friendship grew stronger in the aftermath of their victory. They had become more than just allies, they had become true partners, their bond forged in the fires of their shared struggle. Sophie no longer felt like a pampered pet, she was a warrior, fighting for the truth. And Ziggy, once a distrustful street dog, had found a friend, someone who understood him and his past. The island began to heal. The pets, once controlled by the system, were now free. The dogs who had been locked away in the facility, their spirits broken, were given new homes and a second chance at life. But Sophie knew the battle wasn't truly over. There would always be systems of power, always hidden truths to uncover. But as long as she had Ziggy by her side, and as long as the island remained true to its new path, Sophie knew they could face whatever came next. They had broken the chains. And together, they would continue to fight for freedom, for truth, and for the bond that had brought them together. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey with Sophie and Ziggy in the secret language of dogs revealed. Together, they uncovered dark secrets hidden beneath the surface of the island paradise and fought for the truth to come to light. Their bond, their courage, and their determination to change the fate of the animals have shown us that no matter how small the voice, it can make a difference. If you enjoyed this mysterious and emotional story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling adventures. And make sure to hit the notification bell so you never miss out on the next big story. We want to hear from you. What did you think of the twists and revelations in the story? What would you have done if you were in Sophie or Ziggy's paws? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, remember, truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how deeply it's buried.